I am Nia, 32 years old, and I spent my entire life protecting my grandparents' legacy from the very people who should have cherished it. When my grandfather passed away and left me his historic Brooklyn brownstone, I knew my family would come for it. So I quietly locked it away in an irrevocable trust and told no one. Last Tuesday, my brother kicked my front door open, slammed a forged deed on my coffee table, and told me I had until Friday to pack my bags. I just smiled, took a sip of my wine, and asked him how much he paid the fake notary. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members who tried to take what is rightfully yours. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in Bedford Stuyvesant, the kind of crisp autumn night where the streetlights cast a warm golden glow against the century-old red brick of my brownstone. I was sitting on my emerald green velvet sofa, enjoying a rare moment of peace after a 60-hour work week as an investment strategist. I had just poured myself a glass of Cabernet and settled in to review some portfolio reports. The house was silent, holding the comforting history of my grandparents, who had worked 3 shifts a day in the 1970s just to secure this piece of property. To them, this house was more than brick and mortar. It was survival. It was black wealth built from calloused hands and unwavering determination to leave something valuable behind for the next generation. That peaceful silence was shattered when the heavy oak front door flew open. It did not just open. It was shoved inward with such force that the brass handle struck the drywall, leaving a permanent dent. In walked the holy trinity of my family trauma: my older brother Trayvon, my mother Valerie, and Trayvon's wife Chloe. Trayvon led the pack. At 35, he still walked with the unearned swagger of a high school athlete who never quite realized his glory days were long gone. He was the undisputed golden child of our family. A man who had burned through 4 different college majors, 3 failed cryptocurrency startups, and countless financial bailouts from our mother. Yet he still looked down his nose at me with supreme arrogance. Right behind him was Valerie, my mother. She was dressed to the nines in a tailored pantsuit she could not actually afford, clutching a designer bag to project an image of wealth she desperately craved. Her obsession with maintaining appearances at her elite social clubs had driven her to financial ruin more times than I could count. And bringing up the rear was Chloe, my white sister-in-law, wearing her signature oversized organic cotton cardigan and holding a reusable cup of matcha latte. Chloe loved to weaponize wellness terminology and talk about inner peace, while quietly enabling every toxic and greedy move my brother made. She was exactly the type of person moving into Brooklyn, buying up historic black homes, and pricing out the families who had built the community. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my wine glass on a coaster and looked at the 3 of them invading my sanctuary. Trayvon marched straight over to my glass coffee table and slammed a thick manila folder down right on top of my financial reports. He leaned over, planting his hands on the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. The paper he pulled out and shoved in my face was a quitclaim deed. His name was typed clearly across the top line as the new primary owner of the property. "Sign it, Nia," he demanded, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Actually, do not even bother. It is already done. We had the house signed into my name. You have until Friday to get your things out of my property." I stared at the document. It looked incredibly official, complete with a raised notary seal and a signature that looked remarkably like mine, though I knew for an absolute fact I had never signed it. The sheer audacity of the moment hung in the heavy air of the living room. For 20 years they had taken everything from me: my peace of mind, my college tuition, my sense of belonging in my own family. Now they were standing in the home my grandparents had bled for, trying to steal the last piece of generational wealth our family possessed, just to fund another one of Trayvon's delusions. My mother stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the original hardwood floors. She walked straight past me to the fireplace mantel, grabbed a silver-framed photograph of my grandparents, and tossed it casually into the brass trash bin nearby. I felt a spike of pure rage, but I kept my face entirely blank. "Do not look at us like that, Nia," she scolded, adjusting her silk scarf. "This house is far too much responsibility for a single woman anyway. Trayvon is the eldest son. He needs the capital to launch his new tech venture. This brownstone is worth nearly $1 million in this gentrifying market. It is his birthright to leverage it for the good of the family name. You are just like your grandparents, cheap, stubborn, and completely unwilling to help your own blood when they need it most." I took a slow breath, letting the absolute delusion of her words wash over me. Birthright. That was the word she used to justify decades of blatant neglect. While I was working 2 jobs to pay my way through my master's degree, Trevin was living rent-free in her basement. She had always viewed my independence not as an achievement, but as proof that she did not need to care for me. All her maternal protection was reserved for the son who repeatedly bled her dry. And Chloe, ever the opportunist, decided to chime in with her soothing, condescending tone. She stepped past my mother, taking a slow sip of her matcha. "Nia, sweetie, we really do not want this to be negative. We are just trying to elevate the space. This neighborhood is changing so quickly, and this property has such wonderful black energy. I am going to keep these gorgeous floors when I turn the parlor into a commercial yoga studio. It will be a safe space for healing and mindfulness." I looked at Chloe, then at my mother, and finally back to Trayvon. My pulse was entirely steady. Years of navigating high-stakes corporate boardrooms, analyzing volatile markets, and managing millions in private equity had taught me exactly how to handle aggressive, desperate people. I reached forward, picked up the forged deed, and examined the fake signature. The edges of the paper were crisp, fresh from whatever cheap printer they had used to orchestrate this scheme. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a laugh of hysteria or fear, but of profound amusement. I dropped the paper back onto the glass table and looked directly into my brother's eyes. "You really think I would let that happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper yet, carrying enough weight to make his confident smirk falter. "What are you talking about?" Trayvon scoffed, crossing his arms defensively. "It is already filed with the city. You are out by Friday. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I picked up my wine glass and took another measured sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them shift uncomfortably on their feet. "I am just curious, Trayvon," I said, leaning back into the velvet cushions. "Where exactly did you get the cash to bribe a corrupt notary to stamp a forged signature on a real estate document? Because we both know your bank accounts have been overdrawn for months. Did you use the money from selling that sports car Mom bought you last month just to fund this little criminal enterprise of yours?" The color instantly drained from Valerie's face. Trayvon's jaw clenched, the muscles ticking visibly under his skin as his posture stiffened. He opened his mouth to shout to deny it, but the sudden panic in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The game had just begun, and they had no idea they were already playing on my board. "Friday cannot come fast enough," I told him with a sweet smile. "Make sure you bring the movers." The silence that followed my question hung heavy in the room. Trayvon was completely speechless, his jaw working, but producing no sound. That was when Chloe decided it was her time to shine. She stepped in front of her husband, holding her reusable bamboo cup with both hands like it was some kind of sacred chalice. Her oversized organic cotton cardigan brushed against the antique Persian rug my grandmother had bought decades ago. She gave me that deeply condescending head tilt she always used, the one she reserved for people she secretly believed were unhealed or operating at a lower frequency. "Nia, sweetie," she began, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. "Let us not bring this toxic and negative energy into the space. Trayvon and I are actually trying to do something beautiful here. We are trying to bring light into a dark place." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her matcha latte, looking around the pristine parlor that I had meticulously maintained. To her, this was not a home, it was an opportunity. "We are going to take this dilapidated slum and transform it into a soul-cleansing yoga studio and community wellness hub," she explained, her eyes wide with performative innocence. "It is going to be so healing for the neighborhood. And do not worry, I told our contractor that we absolutely have to preserve these original wood floors." They just hold such incredible raw, black energy. It is exactly the rustic aesthetic we want for the main meditation room. I felt a cold, sharp anger crystallize in my chest. I stared at her perfectly clear skin and her $300 sweatpants. She had spent her entire adult life adopting pieces of cultures she did not understand, stripping them of their meaning, and repackaging them for profit. But she was not going to do it to my family. I set my wine glass down on the coaster with a sharp, deliberate click. I stood up slowly, letting my height and presence fill the room. The soothing smile on Chloe's face faltered just a fraction as I stepped toward her. "That energy you are talking about," I said. My voice dropping an octave but remaining deadly calm, "is not an aesthetic for your mood board, Chloe. That energy is the sweat and blood of my grandparents. It is my grandfather working 3 shifts a day at the Transit Authority, and my grandmother scrubbing floors in Manhattan high-rises just so they could afford this house in the 1970s when banks were actively redlining our people out of existence." Chloe took a small step back, but I did not stop speaking. I kept my eyes locked on hers, refusing to let her look away. "You do not get to walk into Bedford Stuyvesant, slap a coat of white paint on my history, and appraise my family legacy with your cheap meditation classes. This house is a monument to Black survival, and it will never be your overpriced playground." The wellness facade cracked instantly. Chloe's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. The performative piece vanished entirely, replaced by the petulant rage of someone who was absolutely not used to being told no. She slammed her matcha cup onto the fireplace mantel, entirely missing the coaster, and spilling a few drops of green liquid onto the polished mahogany. "You know what?" Chloe snapped, her voice losing all its soothing softness and rising to a shrill pitch. "I tried to include you. I tried to honor your history and be respectful of your feelings, but you are just bitter and completely resistant to growth." She aggressively pulled her smartphone from her pocket, tapping the screen with sharp, angry jabs. Trevon looked slightly nervous, watching his wife escalate the situation, but he puffed out his chest and stood his ground, trying to project an authority he did not possess. My mother stood off to the side, clutching her designer bag, waiting for me to break down and beg them to reconsider. "Trevon told you that you had until Friday," Chloe said, glaring at me over the top of her phone. "But clearly we need to establish our boundaries and start the renovations immediately. I am calling the demolition crew right now. I want them here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." She held the phone to her ear, tapping her foot impatiently on the floor she had just claimed to admire. When the person on the other end answered, her voice snapped back to that commanding, entitled tone she used with service workers. "Yes, hi, this is Chloe," she said loudly, making sure I could hear every single word. "I need your crew at the Brooklyn property first thing tomorrow morning. We are moving up the timeline. I want you to tear down that load-bearing brick wall in the main living room. We need an open concept flow immediately, and I am not waiting for the current occupant to pack up her negative attitude." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket, staring at me with a triumphant glare. She expected me to scream. She expected me to panic at the thought of men with sledgehammers destroying the structural integrity of my home. She expected me to finally surrender to the reality that they were in control. Instead, I just looked at her. I looked at my brother, who was sweating slightly under the collar of his shirt. I looked at my mother, who was already calculating how much social capital she could squeeze out of owning a trendy wellness studio. I leaned back against the edge of the sofa, crossed my arms, and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I gave a casual, dismissive shrug. "Knock it down if you want." The words hung in the air, cold and dismissive. Chloe's mouth opened and closed like a stranded fish, her bluff spectacularly called. She clutched her matcha cup to her chest, looking wildly at her husband for support. But before Trayvon could even formulate a response, the real threat lunged forward. My mother, Valerie, closed the distance between us in 3 aggressive, stomping strides. The heavy, suffocating scent of her Chanel perfume rolled over me, sharp and metallic. She loomed over my seated figure, deliberately blocking the ambient light streaming in from the street lamp outside. If this were a film, the camera would be positioned right behind her shoulder, framing me tightly in the shadow of her wrath, making the space feel instantly claustrophobic and hostile. She snatched a glossy lifestyle magazine off the side table, one she had likely brought with her, to pretend she belonged in the wealthy circles she so desperately stalked, and slammed it down onto the glass coffee table with a violent crack. "How dare you speak to your sister-in-law that way?" Valerie hissed, her voice vibrating with a venom she reserved exclusively for me. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at my face, shaking with rage. "You ungrateful, spiteful little girl! You have been nothing but a dark cloud over this family since the day you were born. Trayvon and Chloe are trying to build an empire, a legacy, and you are sitting here playing house in a property you have absolutely no business owning." I did not flinch. I watched the gold bracelets clinking on her wrist, purchased with credit cards she could not pay off. "Look at you," Valerie continued, pacing a tight circle in front of me, her voice rising in pitch to fill the high-ceilinged parlor. "You have no husband. You have no children. You do not even have a real degree. You are a miserable college dropout who spends her days crunching numbers for God knows who, probably some entry-level clerk job you managed to scrape by with because you have zero ambition. Trayvon is an entrepreneur. He has vision. His new logistics startup is on the verge of revolutionizing the supply chain industry. He just needs a capital injection to get it off the ground. This brownstone is sitting here gathering dust when it could be funding the future of the Blackwell family. But you are too selfish to see the bigger picture." I looked down at the glossy magazine she had slammed onto my financial reports. It featured a sprawling Hamptons estate on the cover. A life she desperately craved but could never achieve because she kept financing my brother's catastrophic failures. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, completely ignoring the fingers still pointing at my nose. "A dropout," I repeated slowly, letting the word roll off my tongue. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the original brick walls. "That is a fascinating way to rewrite history, Mother. Truly. Your ability to edit reality to suit your delusional narrative is almost impressive." Valerie bristled, her posture stiffening as if I had physically struck her. "Do not use that tone with me. It is the truth. You quit school because you could not handle the pressure." "I did not quit," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. I stood up smoothly, forcing her to take a quick step back to maintain her dominant position. I leveled my gaze with hers, refusing to let her look away. "I was 19 years old. I had a 4.0 grade point average in my finance program. I went to the registrar's office on a freezing Tuesday morning to register for my sophomore spring semester, only to be told my account was locked for non-payment." "Why was it locked, Valerie? Do you want to tell Chloe? Do you want to tell your precious golden boy? Or should I?" Trayvon suddenly found the architectural molding on the ceiling absolutely fascinating. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, deliberately stepping back into the shadows of the hallway, refusing to meet my eyes. "You forged my signature on a withdrawal slip and drained every single penny of the college fund my grandparents set up for me." I stated, my words cutting through the room like shattered glass. $45,000, wiped out in a single afternoon. And what was that crucial life-saving investment you made with my education money? Oh, right. Trayvon had racked up a massive debt with a very unforgiving sports betting syndicate and then tried to win it back by investing the rest in a fraudulent crypto coin named after a dog. Chloe turned to Trayvon, her eyes wide with shock, the wellness facade completely dropping. "Wait, what? You told me your mother gave you an early inheritance to start your first company." "Inheritance?" I laughed again, a harsh, humorless sound. "She stole from a 19-year-old girl to keep her grown man-child from getting his legs broken by bookies. You forced me onto the streets, Mother. When I confronted you, you told me I was 18, a legal adult, and it was time for me to fend for myself so your son could have a second, or rather a seventh chance. You threw me out of the house with nothing but a duffel bag and a subway card. I slept on library sofas. I worked 3 shifts at a diner just to afford a shared room in Queens. And now, 13 years later, you have the absolute nerve to stand in my living room, look me in the eye, and call me a dropout. You want to steal the only keepsake my grandparents managed to protect from your greedy hands?" Valerie's face turned the violent mottled shade of crimson. Her mask of affluent sophistication completely dissolved, revealing the desperate, entitled woman underneath. She slammed her hand on the table again, uncaring that the antique glass groaned under the impact. She pointed aggressively at my chest, her voice reaching a hysterical shriek that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. "You were a girl. You did not need a finance degree to find a husband. Trayvon is the man of this family. He carries our name. He needed that money to survive. I made a mother's choice to protect my son, something you would understand if you were not so barren and bitter. I did what I had to do for the survival of this family." She took a deep breath, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. She swept her arm around the parlor, gesturing to the crystal chandelier, the marble fireplace, the century-old oak doors. "And this house should never have gone to you. Your grandparents were senile. They were out of their minds in their final years. They bypassed their own daughter, their own flesh and blood, and their eldest grandson, to leave $1 million asset to a disrespectful, vindictive brat who does not even appreciate family. They were crazy to leave this to you. They were not senile." I shot back, my tone razor sharp, slicing through her frantic shouting. "They saw exactly who you were. They watched you siphon every dollar Dad left behind when he died. They watched you enable Trayvon until he became a useless dependent parasite who cannot even hold down a job, let alone run a tech venture. They left this house to me because they knew I was the only one in this cursed bloodline who wouldn't pawn their life's work to a real estate developer for a quick payout to buy designer bags. This property belongs to the eldest son," Valerie roared, completely abandoning logic, law, and reason for sheer, unfiltered entitlement. She pointed at the forged document sitting on my table. "The deed is filed. It is legally his. You have no power here anymore. If you do not pack your bags and leave quietly, Chloe's construction crew is going to come in here tomorrow morning and rip this place down to the studs. You will be dragged out of here by the police in handcuffs. You will be sleeping on the street exactly like you did at 19, and exactly like you deserve." The violent threat echoed through the room, heavy and oppressive. Trayvon puffed his chest out again, finding his arrogant courage now that his mother was actively fighting his battles for him. Chloe stood tall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, nodding in self-righteous agreement with Valerie's unhinged tirade. They truly believed they had won. They truly believed their aggressive volume, their physical presence, and their forged piece of paper had cornered me into submission. They expected me to break down, to cry, to beg them for a few more days, or to desperately ask for a small cut of the profits. I did not scream back. I did not defend my right to exist in my own home. I simply reached forward toward the silver tray resting on the edge of the coffee table. I picked up the open bottle of Cabernet, the dark red liquid catching the amber light of the room, and calmly, deliberately poured myself another glass. I set the bottle down, lifted the crystal stemware, and took a slow, leisurely sip. I let the rich, complex flavor settle on my tongue, enjoying the absolute silence that had suddenly fallen over them as they watched my total lack of panic. I lowered the glass, looking directly into my mother's red, furious face, with a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "Let's see who ends up on the street." The silence that followed my promise hung in the air long after they finally turned around and marched out my front door. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark parlor, watching the streetlights slowly give way to the pale blue creep of dawn over Brooklyn. I had no intention of resting when war had just been declared on my doorstep. I walked into my home office and opened the heavy steel safe tucked beneath my mahogany desk. I retrieved a thick manila envelope and placed it squarely on the center of the kitchen island. Next to it, I set a small, high-definition digital voice recorder. I spent the remaining hours of the darkness brewing a strong pot of dark roast Colombian coffee and watching the pale gray light of dawn slowly illuminate the historic rooftops of Bedford Stuyvesant. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I knew they would not wait until Friday. People driven by greed and entitlement never have the patience to let their schemes simmer. They act on impulse and adrenaline. At precisely 7:45 the next morning, The aggressive rumble of a heavy-duty diesel truck idling directly outside my window proved me right. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, the ceramic mug warm against my palms, and walked into the parlor. I sat down in a plush armchair positioned perfectly to view the main load-bearing wall that separated the parlor from the formal dining room. I pressed the record button on the small device hidden discreetly behind a framed photograph on the side table. The tiny red light blinked to life, capturing the ambient silence of the room. Less than 5 minutes later, the front door was unlocked and shoved open with violent force. They had undoubtedly copied my key during one of their previous uninvited visits. Chloe marched into my home, leading a crew of 3 burly contractors wearing dust-masked work boots and carrying heavy demolition tools. She was dressed in pristine white overalls that had clearly never seen a day of actual manual labor, holding an iced matcha latte in one hand and a rolled-up blueprint in the other. Right behind her came Trayvon and Valerie, both wearing matching expressions of smug superiority. They had come to watch the show. They had come to see me broken and humiliated. "Well, well, well," Chloe announced, her voice echoing brightly off the hardwood floors. She stopped in the center of the room, planting her hands on her hips and looking at me with feigned pity. "You are still sitting here. I honestly thought you would have packed a bag and checked into a motel by now, Nia. I told you we were not playing games. We are elevating this space today." I did not answer her. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the dark liquid coat my tongue. I crossed my legs, keeping my posture completely relaxed. The 3 contractors shifted uncomfortably, adjusting their heavy sledgehammers and pry bars. They looked from Chloe to me, clearly confused by the domestic standoff unfolding in what they assumed was a vacant property. One of the contractors, a tall man with a thick beard, addressed Chloe nervously. "You said the property was empty. We are not supposed to do structural demolition with residents inside the work zone." "She is not a resident," Chloe snapped, dismissing the man with a wave of her manicured hand. "She is an unauthorized squatter who is currently in the process of being evicted. My husband is the legal owner of this building. You have the permits I showed you. Now stop standing around and get to work. I want that brick wall gone by lunch." She pointed a sharp finger directly at the massive load-bearing wall that anchored the entire first floor of the brownstone. Trayvon stepped forward, crossing his arms and puffing out his chest, trying to project authority over the hired men. "You heard her?" He barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Tear it down. If she wants to sit there and breathe in drywall dust all day, that is her problem. We have a business to run and a yoga studio to build." Valerie stood near the doorway, a cruel smile playing on her lips. She was practically vibrating with excitement, watching what she believed was my ultimate defeat. "You brought this on yourself, Nia," she called out over the noise of the workers dropping their heavy tool bags onto the floor. "If you had just been agreeable and signed the paperwork like a good sister, we could have done this the easy way. Now you get to watch your precious little sanctuary get ripped apart." I remained entirely silent. I kept my eyes fixed on the lead contractor, who was gripping a massive steel sledgehammer. He looked at me one last time, seeking some kind of protest, some kind of desperate plea to stop him. When I simply took another sip of my coffee and offered him a blank stare, he shrugged, deciding he was paid to break things, not to mediate family disputes. He stepped up to the historic wall, the wall my grandfather had spent months restoring by hand in the late 70s, meticulously pointing the mortar to ensure the century-old brick would stand strong for generations. The contractor swung the sledgehammer back over his shoulder. The heavy steel head arched through the air and slammed into the center of the plaster and brick with a deafening, thunderous crack. The sound was visceral. It reverberated through the floorboards, traveling up my legs and vibrating in my chest. A spiderweb of deep, jagged cracks instantly fractured across the pristine vintage plaster. White dust exploded outward, blooming into the air and settling over the antique rugs and polished mahogany trim. The second swing hit even harder. Chunks of plaster and crumbled century-old brick rained down, crashing onto the floor and sending a thick cloud of chalky debris rolling across the parlor. Chloe clapped her hands together, letting out a short, delighted squeal of victory. "Yes," she cheered, coughing slightly as the dust reached her. That is exactly what we need. Open it all up, let the energy flow. Trevin grinned broadly, wrapping an arm around his wife's waist, while my mother nodded in profound satisfaction. They were celebrating the destruction of our family history, believing every swing of the hammer was a swing against my independence. They thought they were burying me under the rubble. I waited for the third swing. I waited for the structural integrity of the wall to be visibly irreparably compromised. I waited until the damage was undeniable, physical, and legally binding. As the contractor pulled his hammer back for a fourth devastating blow, I casually placed my coffee mug down on the coaster. I stood up, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from my slacks. I reached over to the side table, pressed the button to stop the hidden voice recorder, and slipped the small device into my pocket. Then I picked up the thick manila envelope I had prepared hours earlier. "Stop," I said. My voice was not loud. It was not a scream or a plea. It was a sharp, commanding command that cut cleanly through the ringing echoes of the demolition. The lead contractor froze mid-swing, the heavy hammer hovering dangerously in the air. He lowered it slowly, wiping sweat from his forehead and looking at me with caution. Chloe immediately stepped forward, her face twisting into a mask of pure annoyance. She waved her hands aggressively at the workers. "Do not stop," she ordered shrilly. "I am paying you by the hour. Ignore her. I told you she has no authority here. Keep tearing it down." The contractor hesitated, looking between the two of us. I took 3 slow, measured steps forward, walking directly into the cloud of settling dust until I was standing face to face with my sister-in-law. The arrogant smile on her face faltered as she looked into my eyes and found absolutely no fear. "Sister-in-law," I began, my tone dangerously conversational, almost pleasant. "Do you want to know exactly why I sat there and watched you order these men to smash a hole into the center of this house? Do you want to know why I did not scream or call the police or try to physically block that hammer?" Chloe blinked, taking a small, involuntary step backward. Her eyes darted to Trayvon, who had suddenly gone very still. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, trying to maintain her bravado. "You did not stop us because you finally realized you lost Nia. You know the deed is in Trayvon's name." I let out a soft, chilling laugh. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. I slowly unclasped the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked parchment papers. They were not standard real estate forms. They bore the intricate official seals of the federal government. "I did not stop you, Chloe, because I needed you to commit the crime first," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that forced the entire room to lean in to hear me. "I needed to let you physically cross the line. You see, when you look at this house, you just see a cheap flip. You see a dilapidated slum you can gentrify with bamboo floors and $50 meditation classes. But this house is not a standard civilian property." I held up the first document, turning it so the bold black lettering at the top was perfectly visible to her, my brother, and my mother. 3 years ago, before my grandfather passed away, I worked with a team of historical preservationists. I explained, watching the color begin to drain from Chloe's perfectly bronzed face. "We spent 2 years authenticating the history of this exact building. This property was a documented safe house on the Underground Railroad. It was a pivotal meeting location for civil rights leaders in the 1960s. Because of my relentless legal work, this brownstone was officially inducted into the National Register of Historic Places." The silence in the room was so absolute I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The 3 burly contractors instantly dropped their tools, the heavy metal clanking loudly against the floor as they instinctively backed away from the damaged wall. They knew exactly what those words meant in the construction industry. Chloe stared at the paper, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a sudden creeping panic. What does that mean?" she stammered, her voice trembling. I took a step closer, backing her into the dust-covered debris. "It means," I smiled a cold, ruthless smile, "that this is a federal historic landmark. It means that altering, demolishing, or damaging the structural integrity of this building without direct, explicit authorization and permits from the federal government and the State Preservation Board is not a civil dispute. It is not a fine you can pay off." I tossed the heavy stack of federal certificates directly onto her chest, forcing her to scramble to catch them before they hit the floor. It is a federal felony, I stated, my words landing like physical blows. And you just brought an unauthorized, unlicensed crew to bash a hole into a federally protected structure. You just committed a crime against the United States government, Chloe. And I have you on tape ordering the destruction. So no, you are not paying a fine. You are looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The heavy metal of the sledgehammer hit the floor with a resonating clang that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. The lead contractor did not wait for another word. He stared at the federal seals on the documents scattered across the hardwood floor and then looked back at Chloe with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. I am not losing my contractor's license or going to a federal penitentiary so you can sell overpriced yoga mats, he barked. His voice was rough, stripping away any remaining authority Chloe thought she possessed. He signaled his men with a sharp jerk of his chin. Pack it up. We are out of here right now. The three burly men scrambled, grabbing their pry bars and heavy canvas tool bags. They did not even glance at Traven as they marched straight past him, their heavy boots tracking white plaster dust across the antique Persian rugs. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind them, echoing with a finality that made Chloe visibly flinch. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the parlor. Her pristine white overalls were now covered in a fine layer of chalky debris. The organic wellness aesthetic she worked so hard to cultivate completely disintegrated under the crushing weight of impending legal ruin. Her mouth opened and closed silently as she stared at the federal certificates resting near her $300 sneakers. She spun around to face her husband, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch that grated against my ears. "Trayvon, do something!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the mess on the floor. "You told me this was handled. You told me the house was legally yours, and that the permits were just a formality. I cannot have a federal record, Trayvon. My brand partnerships will drop me instantly." Trayvon realized his wife was looking at him not as a strong provider, but as an incompetent failure. It was the one thing his fragile, inflated ego simply could not handle. He stomped across the room, his boots crunching loudly over the shattered pieces of century-old brick and plaster. He stopped mere inches from me, his chest heaving, his face contorted into an ugly, desperate snarl. He was trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic he had relied on since we were teenagers. He pointed a thick finger right between my eyes. "It is handled," Trayvon spat, his voice vibrating with a volatile mixture of fear and rage. "Do not let her play mind games with you, Chloe. She is bluffing. She is just trying to stall because she knows she is beaten. I filed the quitclaim deed with the county clerk 3 days ago. The property is legally in my name. I am the sole owner of this brownstone. Historic landmark or not, I hold the deed. I have the title. I will hire the best real estate lawyers in Manhattan to force the demolition permits through tomorrow morning. You are nothing but a squatter, Nia. You have no legal right to tell my contractors what to do, and you have absolutely no power here." If a camera were capturing this scene, it would be slowly pulling backward, widening the frame to take in the entire parlor with a smooth, steady motion. In the center, Trayvon was a red-faced, sweating mess of unearned confidence, his veins popping against his neck. Chloe was vibrating with panic by the fireplace, clutching her matcha cup like a lifeline. Valerie stood frozen near the doorway, her designer bag clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes darting nervously between her golden child and the destruction on the floor. And there I was, standing perfectly still amidst the ruin of my grandmother's wall, entirely unbothered. The physical distance between us emphasized my absolute emotional detachment and total control over the space. Years of navigating high-stakes corporate boardrooms, analyzing volatile global markets, and dismantling ruthless private equity managers had trained me for this exact moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I let a long, agonizing silence stretch out. I tilted my head, studying the sweat forming on his upper lip. I stepped around him, completely ignoring his pointed finger, and walked back over to the glass coffee table. I picked up my wine glass, swirling the dark crimson liquid with a steady hand. So I said, my voice smooth and conversational, cutting through his heavy, ragged breathing. Let me make sure I understand this perfectly. You are stating for the record in front of witnesses that you are the sole undisputed legal owner of this property. You executed the transfer and you accept all legal and financial responsibilities tied to that deed. Yes, Trayvon barked, squaring his shoulders and thrusting his chin forward. It is mine. Signed, sealed, and delivered. You are out. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It bounced off the high ceilings, bright and merciless. I set the wineglass down. Are you absolutely sure about that, Trayvon? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because if you are the sole owner of a commercial asset currently valued at $1.2 million, which you acquired for $0 in a non-spousal transfer, that constitutes a massive taxable windfall. You see, you did not inherit this property through a legitimate probate process. You filed a fraudulent quitclaim deed. You bypassed the irrevocable trust I secretly placed this house in years ago. But in your desperate rush to steal my home, you triggered an immediate, unexempted tax liability. I crossed my arms, watching his aggressive posture begin to physically deflate. You see, brother, I work in high-level corporate finance. I manage complex tax liabilities for people who make your imaginary logistics startup look like a children's lemonade stand. When my legal team flagged the notification that a forged deed had been filed against my trust, I did not call the local police. That would have been entirely too easy, and you would have just cried to mother to pay your bail. Instead, I immediately forwarded the transfer documents to the Internal Revenue Service. I took a step forward, ensuring he caught every single word. I expedited a fraud and asset transfer report directly to the federal tax authorities. Because you aggressively claimed this property as a direct capital acquisition, you are now personally liable for the immediate taxation on its full market value. A bill for capital gains tax plus early filing penalties and suspected fraud review fees was generated and mailed out to your registered address this morning. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, lowering my voice so he had to hear every devastating syllable. You owe the IRS $340,000, Trayvon. It is due immediately. And because it is tied to an asset transfer you fraudulently orchestrated across state and federal lines, you cannot discharge it in bankruptcy court. All the blood drained from Trayvon's face in an instant. His tan skin turned a sickly ashen gray. His arms dropped limply to his sides, his arrogant posture collapsing like a punctured balloon. He had no money. His bank accounts had been overdrawn for months. He could not even afford a decent tailored suit, let alone a six-figure tax bill owed to the most ruthless collection agency on the planet. Valerie let out a strangled, horrified gasp. Her designer bag slipped from her fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud, spilling lipstick and credit cards across the room. Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. How dare you report him to the IRS? You know your brother does not have a dime to his name. I know exactly how much money he has, Mother, I replied, taking my time to set my crystal wine glass down on the table. That is entirely the point. For decades, you have shielded him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. You paid off his bookies, you covered his rent, you bailed out his failed crypto ventures with my stolen tuition money. But you cannot bail him out of a federal tax lien. The IRS does not care that he is your golden child. They only care that he claimed $1 million asset and now owes them their cut. And when he cannot pay, they will garnish any future wages, seize his bank accounts, and throw him in federal prison for tax evasion. The parlor erupted into absolute chaos. The united front my family had formed to intimidate me shattered instantly. Trayvon stood frozen, his jaw slung open, staring at the dust-covered floor, as the mathematical reality of his situation finally penetrated his thick skull. But it was Chloe who moved first. The soothing, mindful yoga instructor persona vanished in a heartbeat. Her eyes darted wildly around the room before locking onto her husband. The heavy silence was broken by her sharp, ragged breathing. Trayvon. She whispered, her voice trembling before rapidly escalating into a shrill, ear-piercing shriek. $340,000. You told me the property transfer was clean. You looked me in the eye and swore to me that your sister was legally disinherited and the house was free and clear. You said we only needed to cover the renovation costs. Chloe. Baby, just calm down, Trevon stammered, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. He took a step toward her, but she recoiled as if he were diseased. I can fix this. I know a guy who handles tax loopholes. We just need to sell the house quickly and pay off the lien before they finalize the audit. Sell the house, I interrupted, letting out a sharp bark of laughter. You cannot sell a house with a contested title and a federal fraud investigation pending on the deed. The property is locked in a legal deep freeze. You own nothing but the tax debt. Chloe ignored me, her fury entirely directed at the man she had married. Her hands shook violently as she gripped her expensive smartphone. Do not tell me to calm down, Trevon, she screamed, her face turning a blotchy red. You lied to me. You told me this was a guaranteed investment. I told my father this was a guaranteed investment. Valerie stepped between them, desperately trying to play the peacemaker to save her son's crumbling marriage. Chloe, please, she begged, reaching out to touch her daughter-in-law's arm. Trevon was just trying to secure your future. We can figure this out as a family. We just need to talk to Nia and get her to rescind the IRS report. Do not touch me, Chloe snapped, slapping Valerie's hand away with a vicious strike. There is no figuring this out. Do you have any idea what I did to get the demolition crew here today? Do you know how much I paid them in advance to bypass the city permit waiting period? Trevon swallowed hard beads of sweat rolling down his temples. How much, Chloe? Where did you get the cash? I wired $25,000 to the lead contractor at 6 o'clock this morning, Chloe confessed, her voice cracking with hysteria. And I did not use our joint account because you drained it to buy those stupid custom rims for your leased Mercedes. I used the corporate account from my father's real estate holding company in Connecticut. I told him it was an emergency bridge loan for a commercial property flip. The room went dead silent again. Even Valerie stopped her frantic pacing, staring at Chloe in absolute horror. I slowly uncrossed my legs and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I looked at my sister-in-law, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I had set the trap expecting them to stumble into a basic real estate fraud charge, but Chloe, in her infinite arrogance, had just handed me a masterpiece. Let me make sure I am hearing you correctly, sister-in-law, I said, my tone conversational and bright. You took $25,000 of corporate funds from a limited liability company registered in the state of Connecticut. You then wired those funds across state lines into New York to finance an unlicensed contractor to perform an illegal demolition on a federally protected historic landmark. And you did all of this based on a fraudulently acquired deed. Chloe stopped breathing. Her eyes widened as my words painted a terrifyingly clear picture of her actions. Do you know what the Federal Bureau of Investigation calls that, Chloe? I asked, tilting my head and offering her a sweet, predatory smile. They do not call it elevating the space. They call it wire fraud. They call it interstate corporate embezzlement. And when you mix illicitly obtained funds with a fraudulent real estate transaction, they call it money laundering. Trevon grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots as he backed away from his wife. Are you crazy? He shouted at her, his voice cracking. You involved your father's company in this. Why would you do that? We are going to go to jail. I did it because you are completely broke, Trevon. Chloe shrieked back, tears of rage spilling down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the white plaster dust on her face. You promised me $1 million Brooklyn brownstone. You promised me a wellness empire. Instead, you dragged me into a federal crime. My father is going to kill me. He sits on the board of directors for 3 different banks. If his company gets dragged into a federal money laundering investigation, the SEC will strip his licenses. Then call him. Valerie ordered, her voice shrill and commanding as she abandoned all pretense of defending her son. Call your father right now, Chloe. He is a powerful man. He has teams of corporate lawyers on retainer. Tell him what happened. Tell him it was a mistake. He can hire a legal team to crush Nia in court and make this entire IRS problem disappear. He has the money to bury her. For once, Chloe did not argue with her mother-in-law. Her fingers flew across the screen of her smartphone, her manicured nails clicking frantically against the glass. I sat back against the velvet cushions of my sofa, watching the beautiful, chaotic destruction of their alliance. I felt my pulse slow and steady, a familiar rhythm I always experienced right before a major corporate acquisition closed. Chloe lifted the phone to her ear, pacing a tight circle in the center of the dust-covered parlor. "Come on, Dad, pick up," she muttered, biting her lower lip. "Pick up the phone." The tinny sound of the line connecting echoed in the quiet room. Chloe let out a massive sigh of relief. "Dad," she cried out, her voice instantly reverting to the whiny, helpless tone of a spoiled child. "Dad, I need your help. I made a huge mistake with the Brooklyn property, and I need your legal team right now. Trayvon's sister is trying to set us up and—" She stopped abruptly. The voice on the other end of the line was not the soothing, reassuring tone of a wealthy father ready to bail out his princess. It was sharp, frantic, and distorted by panic. Even from where I sat, I could hear the sheer volume of his shouting bleeding through the phone speaker. Chloe blinked, holding the phone slightly away from her ear. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she asked, her face contorting in confusion. "What do you mean you cannot authorize a lawyer?" More frantic shouting emanated from the device. I watched as the last remaining traces of color drained from Chloe's face, leaving her looking like a marble statue. Her knees visibly buckled, and she had to reach out and grip the edge of my grandmother's antique mantle to keep from collapsing onto the floor. "Frozen?" she whispered, staring blankly at the wall. "What do you mean your accounts are frozen? Dad, you have tens of millions in liquid assets. You have to help me. I am facing federal wire fraud charges." Trayvon stepped forward, grabbing Chloe's shoulder. "What is he saying?" he demanded roughly. "Tell him to wire the money to my account." Chloe slapped his hand away, dropping the phone completely. The device hit the floor with a loud crack, but the call remained connected. Her father's voice continued to shout into the silent room, painting a picture of total financial devastation. "He cannot wire anything," Chloe said, her voice completely hollow, devoid of all emotion. "His company was targeted this morning. A massive private equity firm bought up all his outstanding debt portfolios and executed a hostile takeover at the opening bell. The board of directors ousted him an hour ago. The federal regulators are auditing his entire holding company. He does not have access to a single corporate account. He is ruined." Valerie gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Trayvon stumbled backward, hitting the wall and sliding down until he was sitting on the floor amidst the rubble of the plaster. I picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, appreciative sip. It tasted exceptionally good. I looked down at Chloe, who was staring at me with a new, profound realization dawning in her tear-filled eyes. "What was the name of that private equity firm again, Chloe?" I asked, offering her a polite, helpful smile. "Was it by any chance Apex Financial Holdings? Because if it was, I should probably tell you I was just promoted to their senior acquisitions director last week. I hear their hostile takeover department is absolutely ruthless." The air in the parlor grew thick and heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The afternoon sun shifted outside, dipping behind the tall, historic brownstones across the street and plunging the perimeter of the room into deep shadow. The remaining light seemed to pool directly over the center of the floor, focusing sharply on my face and casting long, unforging shadows behind my family. The ambient warmth of the morning was entirely gone, replaced by a chilling clinical reality. They were no longer the predators in this scenario. They were the prey. Valerie could not process the shift in power. Her brain, steeped in decades of unchallenged narcissism and absolute control over my life, simply short-circuited. The cognitive dissonance of realizing her scapegoat daughter was a titan of finance, while her golden boy was a penniless fraud, broke whatever fragile restraint she had left. Her face contorted into an ugly, twisted mask of pure hatred. The sophisticated, affluent persona she projected to the world evaporated, leaving only a desperate, vicious woman cornered by her own failures. "You are a demon!" Valerie shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat with feral intensity. She lunged at me, her hands curled into claws aiming directly for my face. It was a desperate, uncalculated attack born of pure panic. She fully expected me to cower, to shrink away, and take the abuse just as I had done when I was a terrified 19-year-old girl being thrown out onto the freezing streets of Queens. But I was no longer that girl. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As her hand arched through the air toward my cheek, I moved with practiced fluid precision. I raised my arm and caught her wrist mid-strike. The impact was loud, a sharp slap of flesh against flesh that echoed off the ruined plaster walls. My grip closed around her wrist like a steel vise, locking her arm in place. Valerie gasped, her eyes widening in profound shock as she struggled against my hold. She pulled, she yanked, she twisted, but I did not yield a single inch. I held her there, suspended in her own violence, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "You're a devil," she hissed, switching to our native tongue in her absolute hysteria. "Meiruasa, you cursed your brother and his family. You're just a ragged waiter." I stared into her wild, panicked eyes, feeling nothing but cold, clinical pity. I tightened my grip just enough to make her wince before forcefully throwing her hand away. The momentum sent her stumbling backward, her expensive designer heels catching on the debris of the demolished wall. She fell hard against Trevon's legs, gasping for breath as she clutched her bruised wrist. "You never bothered to find out what I have been doing for the last 10 years, did you?" I said, my voice dangerously calm, slicing through her heavy, ragged breathing. "You were so utterly convinced of your own narrative, so certain that without you, I would fail, that you never once looked past your own delusions. You wanted me to be a tragedy. You needed me to be a struggling waitress so you could justify stealing my future to fund Trayvon's failures." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. I withdrew a thick, textured card and tossed it effortlessly onto the center of the glass coffee table. It landed with a soft, distinct thud, perfectly illuminated by the shaft of sunlight cutting through the room. The card was matte black minimalist and heavy, featuring deeply embossed gold foil lettering that caught the light and gleamed like a weapon. "I am not a waitress," I stated, my tone echoing with absolute unyielding authority. "I am the Senior Vice President of the Vanguard Horizon Investment Fund. We are the Apex Predator division of Apex Financial Holdings. We do not just manage money, Mother. We dismantle companies. We liquidate liabilities. We acquire leverage. And that massive corporate entity that just froze Chloe's father's assets this morning, stripping him of his board seat and locking him out of his own life's work, is the exact fund that I personally direct." The silence that followed was catastrophic. It was the sound of 3 separate realities imploding simultaneously. Chloe let out a strangled whimpering sound, pressing both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were fixed on the gold lettering of the business card, as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. She slowly raised her head, looking at me with a mixture of absolute terror and profound disbelief. The realization crashed over her in visible waves. She had not just provoked a disgruntled sister-in-law. She had declared war on the architect of her own family's financial destruction. She had handed her father's corporate routing numbers over to a woman who possessed the exact legal and financial weaponry to annihilate him. "You did this," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "You targeted my father's company. You ruined him just to get back at me." "You flatter yourself, Chloe," I replied, offering her a thin, humorless smile. "I did not target your father to get back at you. I targeted his company because his commercial real estate portfolio was over-leveraged, bloated with toxic assets, and vulnerable to a hostile buyout. It was simply good business. The fact that you foolishly utilized his corporate accounts to fund an illegal demolition on a federally protected landmark in New York merely provided my compliance team with the exact legal justification we needed to trigger an immediate federal asset freeze. You handed me the keys to his kingdom, and I simply locked him out." Trayvon was hyperventilating now. He sat slumped against the wall, his legs splayed out in front of him, entirely paralyzed by cowardice. He looked back and forth between me and his wife, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had spent his entire life bullying me, relying on his physical size and our mother's unwavering protection to shield him from reality. Now stripped of his stolen money and facing the crushing weight of a massive IRS tax lien, he had completely shut down. There was no fight left in him. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man. Valerie, however, was incapable of accepting defeat. Her brain refused to process the empirical evidence sitting right in front of her. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the white plaster dust off her expensive silk blouse with shaking hands. She pointed a trembling finger at the business card, refusing to actually look at it. Lies. She spat, her voice shrill and trembling. It is all lies. You printed that card at a cheap copy shop just to scare us. You do not have millions of dollars. You do not run investment funds. You are a college dropout. You could not even handle a simple undergraduate finance program. You quit because you were weak. You are trying to trick us so we will leave, but this house belongs to Trayvon. I looked at the woman who had brought me into this world. I looked at the deep lines of bitterness etched around her mouth, the frantic denial burning in her eyes, the desperate need to cling to a superiority she had never actually earned. She had forged my signature, stolen my future, and cast me out into the cold, yet she still believed she held the moral high ground. She still believed I was beneath her. I did not quit, Valerie, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whispering calm that filled every corner of the room. You drained my tuition accounts to pay off a sports betting syndicate so your golden boy would not get his legs broken. You forced me onto the streets. But what you failed to realize is that survival breeds a very specific kind of competence. When I was sleeping on library sofas and working triple shifts, I was not crying over what you stole. I was learning. I bypassed the traditional academic route and earned my Series 7 and Series 63 licenses independently. I outworked, I outsmarted, and I outmaneuvered every single person in the room until Vanguard Horizon handed me the keys to their acquisitions department. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, closing the distance until I was looking down into her wide, panicked eyes. I watched the pulse fluttering erratically in her neck. You have spent the last 5 years parading around this city pretending to be a wealthy, sophisticated matriarch. I continued, my tone conversational, yet dripping with lethal intent. You attend charity galas. You wear Chanel perfume. You carry designer handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. You act as though you belong to a social class that you have absolutely no claim to. But wealth is not about what you wear, Valerie. It is about what you own. And you own nothing. Valerie bristled, her pride rearing up like a wounded animal. I own plenty, she snapped defensively, crossing her arms over her chest. I live a very comfortable life, a life you could never understand. I smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator circling a trap that had already been sprung. Is that right? I asked, tilting my head. Then tell me, Mother, how exactly did you finance that lifestyle? Because according to the comprehensive credit portfolio I reviewed this morning, your personal bank accounts contain exactly $412. Your mortgage is 3 months in arrears. And you have been floating your entire existence on a web of high-interest predatory credit lines. Valerie froze. The defensive anger in her eyes was instantly replaced by a stark, naked terror. Her arms dropped slowly to her sides. I watched the realization hit her, and I did not let up the pressure for a single second. You see? I explained, keeping my eyes locked onto hers. When Vanguard Horizon executed the takeover of Chloe's father's holding company, we did not just acquire his commercial real estate assets. We acquired all of his subsidiary debt collection agencies. We bought the entire portfolio of high-risk consumer debt that his firm managed. We own it all now. I leaned in closer, my voice a velvet whisper of absolute destruction. And guess who currently holds the $200,000 credit debt you used to buy those designer goods last month? The air over Brooklyn on Friday morning felt unnaturally heavy, carrying the suffocating electric stillness that always precedes a violent storm. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, the soft golden light of dawn, catching the dew on the wrought iron fences and casting long, oppressive shadows across the pavement. The brownstone stood tall and unyielding, a silent fortress against the creeping chaos that was about to unfold on its front steps. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the harsh grinding screech of worn air brakes shattered the morning quiet. A battered, unmarked box truck aggressively hopped the curb, its tires crushing the edge of my manicured flower beds, before slamming into park directly in front of my house. I did not have to look out the window to know who it was. Traven had always been devastatingly predictable. When cornered, a rational person assesses the damage and surrenders. A narcissist, stripped of his delusions, however, simply doubles down completely, abandoning logic for the desperate animalistic need to win. He had spent the last 48 hours watching his wife's family empire crumble and his own federal tax liabilities multiply, but his twisted mind had manufactured one final delusional lifeline. If he could just physically remove me from the premises, the house would be his. He believed that brute force could somehow overwrite federal law. The heavy steel doors of the truck swung open with a violent rattle. I stepped out of the parlor and pulled open my solid oak front door, stepping out onto the high stone porch. I was not wearing sweatpants or a casual morning robe. I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a razor-sharp midnight blue tailored suit, the fabric perfectly structured, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable authority. My hair was pulled back immaculately, and I looked down at the street from the top of the stone steps with the cold, detached gaze of an apex predator watching a wounded animal stumble into a trap. Trayvon leaped out of the passenger side of the truck, and the physical toll of the last 2 days was written all over him. He looked entirely unhinged. His designer shirt was rumpled and stained with sweat. His eyes were bloodshot and manic, and his usual arrogant swagger had been replaced by a twitchy, explosive panic. Valerie climbed out right behind him, looking equally haggard. She was clutching a cheap, oversized tote bag, having apparently been forced to leave her beloved designer purses at home, now that she knew I held the debt that financed them. Yet despite her disheveled appearance, her eyes still burned with that same toxic, venomous entitlement. "Get out!" Trevon barked, waving his arm toward the back of the truck. 4 massive, heavily tattooed men climbed out of the cargo bay. Unlike the pristine matcha-drinking contractors Chloe had hired earlier in the week, these men were not licensed professionals. They were brute force, hired for cash under the table. They wore torn shirts and scuffed work boots, carrying heavy-duty industrial trash bags, thick coils of rope, and heavy steel crowbars. They looked up at the historic brownstone, then at me standing alone on the porch, sizing up the situation with grim, silent calculation. "This is the place," Trayvon yelled, his voice cracking with hysterical urgency. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "I want her out. I want every piece of furniture, every piece of clothing, every single thing in that house thrown out onto the sidewalk. If she tries to stop you, physically move her. I am paying you to clear the property, so clear it." The 4 men rolled their shoulders, gripping their crowbars, and began to slowly advance toward the wrought iron gate at the bottom of my steps. I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at the hired thugs with a gaze so chillingly calm that the lead man instinctively slowed his pace. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice slicing clearly through the humid morning air, "I strongly suggest you stop exactly where you are." The men paused, looking at each other, sensing the absolute lack of fear in my posture. They were accustomed to screaming, crying, and panic during forced evictions. They were not accustomed to a woman in a power suit standing her ground like a general commanding a battlefield. "Do not listen to her!" Trevon screamed, spit flying from his lips as he shoved past his own mother to reach the bottom of the stairs. "She is lying. She does not own this house. I do." I rested my hands on the stone balustrade, looking past Trayvon to address the men directly. "The man screaming at you is currently under active federal investigation for real estate fraud, tax evasion, and corporate embezzlement." I stated, my words ringing with absolute terrifying clarity. "This building is a federally protected historic landmark. The moment your boots cross the threshold of my front door with the intent to damage property or remove assets, you transition from being hired movers to being accomplices in a federal crime. I have high-definition cameras recording your faces, your license plates, and your weapons. If you take one more step, you will be spending the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary." The lead thug stopped completely. He lowered his crowbar, his eyes darting from the cameras mounted discreetly under my porch awning back to Trayvon's sweating, frantic face. He had been paid to move furniture, not to tangle with the federal government. "Hey, man," the thug grunted, taking a deliberate step backward. "You said this was a standard domestic eviction. You didn't say nothing about no federal landmarks or fraud investigations. We ain't getting locked up for this." "They are lying," Trayvon shrieked, his voice reaching a fever pitch of sheer desperation. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, folded piece of paper, thrusting it wildly into the air. He shook it at the men, then shook it at me, his eyes wide and completely deranged. "I have the deed!" Trayvon roared, slapping the paper with his free hand. "I filed it. It is legal. I am the man of this family, and I make the decisions. You hear me, Nia? I am the owner." Valerie rushed up behind him, nodding furiously, her face twisted in a vicious sneer. "Show them Trayvon. Show them the paper. She is just a spiteful, bitter girl trying to steal what belongs to you. Throw her out into the street where she belongs." Trayvon took a step onto the bottom stair, waving the paper so violently it nearly tore in his hands. "I don't care what your title is," he screamed, his voice echoing off the surrounding brownstones and causing neighbors to peek out from behind their curtains. "I don't care what company you run or what money you think you have. This deed is notarized. The ink is dry. If the cops come, I'm still the owner. Throw her out." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills and shoved it toward the lead thug. "I will double your pay. Just get up there and drag her out of my house." The sight of the cash made the men hesitate. Greed battled with caution in their eyes. The lead thug looked at the money, then looked up at me, his grip tightening on his crowbar as he slowly began to raise his boot toward the second step. I did not break eye contact with him. I simply waited. Before the man's boot could even touch the stone, the heavy, oppressive silence of the neighborhood was shattered by a sound that made everyone freeze. It was not the high, frantic wail of a standard New York Police Department cruiser. It was a deep, resonant, pulsating siren that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath our feet. Trayvon whipped his head around his face, instantly draining of whatever color it had left. Valerie gasped, clutching her chest as she stumbled backward onto the sidewalk. The 4 hired thugs immediately dropped the cash and their crowbars, holding their hands up in the air as they scrambled away from the stairs, their survival instincts finally overriding their greed. Coming around the corner of the avenue at a terrifying speed were 3 massive armored Chevrolet Suburbans. They were entirely black, boasting heavily tinted bulletproof windows and aggressive steel push bars mounted to their front grills. Red and blue strobe lights flashed violently from inside their grills and behind their windshields, bathing the street in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The vehicles did not park neatly. They swerved aggressively, cutting off the front and back of the rented box truck and completely boxing Trayvon and his crew in. The heavy tires screeched against the asphalt, kicking up a cloud of dust as they slammed to a halt directly in front of my gate. The heavy armored doors of the SUVs swung open simultaneously. Men in dark tactical gear bearing the bold gold letters FBI across their backs poured out of the vehicles. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. There was no shouting and no frantic movements. There was only the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots hitting the pavement as they instantly formed an impenetrable perimeter around the property. The 4 hired thugs who had been ready to tear my house apart a minute ago did not need to be told twice. They immediately dropped the cash and their crowbars, sinking to their knees on the sidewalk and lacing their hands behind their heads in a posture of complete and utter surrender. From the rear passenger door of the center SUV stepped a man who looked entirely out of place among the tactical armor. He wore an immaculate tailored slate gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie. He carried a slim leather briefcase and walked with the measured, unhurried pace of a man executing a flawless legal checkmate. This was Arthur Sterling, a senior federal prosecutor specializing in high-stakes corporate and real estate fraud. Trevon was paralyzed on the bottom step of my porch. His arm was still raised, his fist still clutching the fraudulently acquired property deed. His hand began to tremble violently. The thick parchment paper rustled in the sudden oppressive quiet of the street. My eyes locked onto that fragile piece of paper, watching it shake uncontrollably before my gaze slowly tracked up to meet Trevon's wide, bloodshot eyes. A slow, deeply satisfying half-smile spread across my face. Arthur Sterling stopped at the bottom of the steps, flanked by two towering federal agents. He looked at Trevon with an expression of mild, clinical distaste. "Mr. Trevon Adams," the prosecutor said, his voice carrying the precise, resonant authority of a courtroom veteran, "you are currently holding on to physical evidence of a federal crime. I strongly suggest you do not attempt to destroy it." Valerie, who had been cowering near the wrought iron gate, suddenly shrieked. Her survival instinct demanded that she regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling into a nightmare. "You have no right to be here," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "This is a domestic dispute. My son is the legal owner of this property. She is the one committing fraud. Arrest her." She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at me, expecting the authorities to blindly follow her commands, just as she had forced the rest of the world to do for decades. One of the federal agents simply stepped into Valerie's line of sight, using his sheer physical bulk to force her backward. "Ma'am, step back onto the sidewalk and remain silent." The agent commanded, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. Valerie's mouth snapped shut, her eyes darting frantically, looking for a way out that did not exist. The illusion of her power had vanished instantly in the face of genuine federal authority. I slowly descended the stone steps. The sharp click of my heels against the masonry sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. I stopped 2 steps above Trevon, looking down at him. He looked so small in that moment, a terrified little boy dressed in a grown man's rumpled designer clothes, desperately waiting for his mother to fix a mess that was entirely unfixable. "Let us talk about that piece of paper you are holding, brother," I said, my tone conversational, as if I were lecturing a particularly slow intern. "You see, you and Mother operated under a very basic and very flawed assumption. You assumed that when our grandparents passed away, they simply signed the title of this historic multi-million-dollar estate over to me. You assumed it was a standard transfer of assets, a simple deed bearing a simple signature. And because you are arrogant and intellectually lazy, you never bothered to dig any deeper than the surface registry." Trevon swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple and stinging his eye. He did not blink. He seemed incapable of looking away from me. "Do you know what an irrevocable trust is, Trevon?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. He did not answer. His breathing was becoming shallow and ragged. "When our grandparents finalized their estate planning, they knew exactly who Valerie was." I continued, my voice slicing clearly through the humid morning air. "They knew she would eventually try to bleed me dry to finance your spectacular failures. They anticipated that she would manipulate, threaten, or outright forge documents to steal my inheritance for her golden child. So they did not just leave me a house. They placed this entire estate, along with several corresponding liquid asset accounts, into a federally registered, irrevocable trust." Valerie let out a strangled gasp from the sidewalk, but the federal agent immediately raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "An irrevocable trust cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit permission of the grantor," I explained, breaking it down into terms his panicked mind could process. "And since the grantors are deceased, the terms of the trust are locked in stone. As the named trustee, I manage the asset, but I do not have the legal authority to unilaterally sell, transfer, or gift the property to anyone. Even if I genuinely wanted to give you this house, Trevon, my signature alone would be legally worthless. A transfer of this magnitude out of the trust requires extensive federal oversight, layers of judicial approval, and the notarized signatures of 3 separate board-appointed legal custodians." I took one more step down, closing the distance until I was towering directly over him. "So when you walked into a county records office and filed a standard transfer deed bearing a single forged signature, you did not secure ownership of a Brooklyn brownstone," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. You triggered an automatic high-priority federal alert for attempting to bypass a restricted trust. You walked right into a federal trap that was designed specifically for you. I watched the blood completely drain from Trayvon's face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His entire body was shaking now, a visible manifestation of his collapsing reality. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, opening his slim leather briefcase and extracting a thick manila folder. Furthermore, the prosecutor added smoothly, his eyes locked onto Trayvon's terrified face. Federal investigators have already visited the cut-rate notary public. You paid $5,000 in cash to stamp that fraudulent document. Faced with the prospect of losing his license and spending a decade in federal prison, your notary was incredibly cooperative. He handed over the security footage from his office, the cash you paid him, and a sworn recorded confession detailing exactly how you orchestrated the forgery. We have you on video handing him the bribe, Mr. Adams. We have the digital footprint of the wire transfers you used to secure the fraudulent filing. The paper trail is absolute and undeniable. Trayvon's knees finally buckled. He did not gracefully sit down. He collapsed onto the hard stone steps, as if the strings holding him up had been violently severed. The forged deed slipped from his sweaty, trembling fingers, fluttering gently to rest near the toe of my expensive stiletto. He stared blankly at the piece of paper, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in mid-air, waiting for gravity to pull him down to his destruction. He slowly tilted his head up to look at me, a profound, soul-crushing terror swimming in his eyes as the mathematical reality of his actions finally penetrated his thick skull. So that means, Trayvon whispered, his voice cracking and barely audible over the low hum of the idling federal SUVs. I leaned down slightly, placing my hands on my knees so he could see the absolute chilling certainty in my eyes. I wanted him to remember this exact moment for the rest of his life. It means, I said, cutting off his trembling words with sharp surgical precision, that your brilliant decision to bribe a notary to forge my signature in order to illegally transfer assets out of a federally protected, irrevocable trust is not a simple real estate dispute. It is a Class A felony for real estate fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy against a federal entity. You are not walking away from this with a slap on the wrist or a fine paid by our mother. You are going to federal prison. The world seemed to spin on its axis. The camera of my mind panned in a slow, merciless, unbroken circle around my brother. The air was thick, suffocating, and crackling with the electric tension of a storm finally breaking. Trayvon simply folded. The remaining strength drained from his legs, and he slumped forward, his forehead nearly resting on the cold stone of the porch. The two federal agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. They did not shout. They did not need to. They simply grabbed Trayvon by the arms, hauling his dead weight upward. The sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing off the brick facades of the street sounded like the slamming of a vault door. Trayvon's chin rested on his chest, his eyes vacant, utterly broken by the realization that his arrogance had finally collided with an immovable object. Valerie's brain, unable to process the absolute failure of her golden child, chose madness. She let out a sound that did not belong in a civilized neighborhood. It was a guttural, primal screech that tore through the quiet street. She launched herself forward, her hands clawing desperately at the tactical vest of the agent holding her son's left arm. "Let him go!" Valerie shrieked, her voice cracking as spit flew from her lips. He did not know what he was doing. He made a mistake. He is a good boy. He is my son, so take your hands off him right now. Ma'am, step back immediately, or you will be charged with assaulting a federal officer, the second agent commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. He stepped between Valerie and Trayvon, creating a physical wall of black armor that she could not bypass. Denied access to her son, Valerie spun around, her eyes wild and rimmed with mascara that was beginning to run, locked onto me. The desperation morphed back into a familiar venomous rage. She marched up the steps until she was inches from my face, pointing a shaking finger directly between my eyes. "You are sick," she spat, her chest heaving violently. "You are deeply, fundamentally sick in the head. You would destroy your own flesh and blood over a piece of property, over a crumbling, dust-filled brownstone. You called the FBI to lock your brother in a cage for what, Nia? $950,000. She let out a harsh, hysterical bark of laughter, turning to address Arthur Sterling and the federal agents as if they were a jury. Do you hear me? She screamed, gesturing wildly at the house. $950,000. Split 3 ways after taxes and renovations. It is barely $300,000. You are destroying your own family, ruining your brother's entire life over a pathetic, miserable fraction of $1 million. You vindictive, bitter little girl, you set him up over pennies. I did not blink. I let her words wash over me, absorbing the full weight of her contempt. For 10 years, I had endured this exact tone, the constant minimization of my worth, the absolute certainty that I was fighting over scraps and acting out of petty jealousy. I extended my right hand without looking away from her. Arthur Sterling, anticipating the gesture with the precision of a man who knew exactly how this execution was choreographed, unclasped his leather briefcase. The polished brass clicked loudly in the morning air. He extracted a thick, heavily bound red folder and placed it firmly into my waiting palm. The vivid crimson cover stood out like a beacon against my dark suit. I gripped the folder, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the parchment inside. $950,000. I repeated, my voice smooth, quiet, and echoing with absolute lethal intent. I tapped the red folder gently against my palm. You think I spent 10 years enduring this family's contempt, swallowing your endless insults, and watching you funnel every cent you had into Trayvon's bottomless pit of failure for barely $1 million, I asked, tilting my head. Valerie's jaw clamped shut. She stared at the red folder, a flicker of profound uncertainty breaking through her blinding rage. You still look at the world through the lens of a desperate, small-minded hustler. Valerie, I said, taking a slow step down to meet her eye to eye. You look at this historic brownstone, and you see a quick flip. You see a cheap renovation and a fast sale to pay off a bookie or buy another leased Mercedes. But Vanguard Horizon does not deal in quick flips. We deal in urban infrastructure. We deal in generational wealth. I flipped the red folder open. The top document was stamped with the official heavy gold seal of the New York State Department of City Planning. This entire neighborhood was quietly rezoned by the government 18 months ago. I explained, my words dropping like anvils onto the quiet porch. The city approved a massive infrastructure expansion. They are building a new multi-line subterranean transit hub to connect Brooklyn's commercial sector directly to the emerging tech sector in Lower Manhattan. Valerie stopped breathing. Her eyes widened, tracking from the federal seal on the document back to my face. Down on the sidewalk, Trayvon had stopped struggling against the agents. He was perfectly still, listening to every word. And do you know what sits exactly at the geographical center of that new transit hub? I asked, my voice dropping to a glacial whisper. Our grandparents' brownstone. I turned the page, revealing a complex architectural blueprint layered with city planning grids and property lines. This property is the keystone parcel required for the city to break ground on the main concourse. I continued, delivering the fatal strike. Without this exact plot of land, the entire billion-dollar project stalls completely. They cannot build around it. They cannot dig under it without securing the surface rights. I have spent the last 14 months aggressively negotiating with city planners, federal transit authorities, and private developers. I drove the price up dollar by agonizing dollar, locking them into a corner where they had absolutely no choice but to meet my demands. Valerie began to shake. Her hands trembled so violently she had to grip the stone railing to keep herself upright. I pulled the final appraisal document from the red folder and held it up so Valerie could read the bold, highlighted numbers at the bottom of the page. I finished the negotiations on Tuesday, I said, the quiet triumph in my voice absolute and unyielding. The property was officially reappraised and locked into a mandatory government buyout contract on Wednesday. I paused, letting the silence stretch out until the tension was physically unbearable, ensuring every single syllable would brand itself permanently into her mind. $15 million, Mother. The numbers hung in the air, dense and suffocating. 15 million. I watched the psychological collapse happen in real time. Valerie's eyes glazed over completely. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords simply stopped functioning. The reality of what had just slipped through their fingers, what Trevon had literally thrown away by committing a felony. It was too massive for her brain to hold. She let out a soft, wheezing gasp. Her knees buckled outward. She did not fall gracefully. She collapsed in a heap of silk and despair, hitting the stone steps hard. She slumped against the iron railing, clutching her stomach, her chest heaving in silent, agonizing sobs that racked her entire frame. She had sacrificed her daughter for a son who had just burned $15 million to the ground. She had facilitated a crime that destroyed her own future. She had nothing left. Absolutely nothing. Down by the federal vehicles, I saw a subtle movement in the deep shadows. Chloe, who had been completely frozen in terror since the FBI arrived, was quietly backing away. Her eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. Seeing her husband in handcuffs facing a decade in federal prison, realizing her father was financially ruined by my firm, and now hearing the astronomical sum of money they had permanently lost, her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She turned her body, slightly sliding her expensive designer bag over her shoulder. Keeping her head down, she attempted to slip past the rear bumper of the last federal SUV, hoping to vanish down the street and abandon Trevon to his fate without a second thought. She took one step beyond the bumper, then a second. Freedom was merely yards away. But before her third step could touch the concrete, a massive hand clad in black tactical gloves clamped firmly onto her shoulder. Chloe let out a sharp gasp as the federal agent spun her around with effortless force. Her designer tote bag slipped from her grasp, spilling organic lip balm and platinum credit cards onto the dirty pavement. "I have nothing to do with this!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she frantically backed away from the agent. The serene, mindful wellness instructor persona she had cultivated for years completely evaporated, replaced by the frantic, high-pitched terror of a cornered animal. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband, who was still paralyzed on the stairs. It was all him. Trevon forced me to do it. I did not know anything about a forged deed or federal landmarks. I am completely innocent. Trevon slowly lifted his head, his tear-streaked face registering the ultimate betrayal. The woman he had stolen for the woman whose lavish lifestyle he had bankrolled with fraudulent money was discarding him the second he became a liability. "I am calling my lawyers!" Chloe shrieked, her chest heaving as she backed herself against the side of the armored SUV. "I am filing for divorce this exact minute. I want nothing to do with him." I watched her desperate performance with a cool, detached amusement. I raised my hand, signaling the federal agent to hold his position for just a moment. I walked down the remaining steps, my heels clicking sharply against the stone, until I stood directly in front of my sister-in-law. "Not quite yet, sister-in-law," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously quiet. "You do not get to simply divorce your way out of federal complicity." Chloe shook her head violently, her blonde hair whipping across her tear-stained face. "I did not sign the deed, Nia. I did not bribe anyone. You cannot do this to me." "You did not sign the deed." I agreed, taking a slow, deliberate step closer, forcing her to press her back flat against the vehicle. "But you did sign the demolition order. You authorized an unlicensed, under-the-table contractor to take sledgehammers to a load-bearing wall inside a federally protected historic property. And more importantly, Chloe, you paid for that demolition using a wire transfer from your father's corporate holding account in Connecticut." Chloe stopped breathing. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as the severe legal implications of my words slammed into her. "You funneled illicit corporate funds across state lines to finance the destruction of a stolen federal landmark," I explained, breaking down the charges with surgical precision. "You transitioned from being a clueless wife to being an active accomplice in a money laundering operation. You are just as guilty as he is." I offered her a chilling, remorseless smile. "But look on the bright side. The highly structured, isolated environment of a federal penitentiary should be absolutely perfect for your daily meditation practice. The energy in there will do wonders for your wellness journey." Chloe let out a breathless, strangled sob. Her knees simply gave out. She slid down the side of the SUV, collapsing onto the pavement in a heap of white cashmere and pure despair. Arthur Sterling gave a subtle nod, and the agent immediately hauled her back to her feet, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around her delicate wrists. She did not fight them. She was completely broken. As the agents began processing Trevon and Chloe, loading them into the back of separate transport vehicles, a sudden, desperate movement caught my eye. Valerie, who had been slumped against the stone railing in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly scrambled forward. She did not stand up. She crawled across the rough stone of the porch, her expensive silk dress tearing against the masonry. I stood tall, looking down at the woman who had tormented me for my entire life. From my vantage point at the bottom of the stairs, she looked incredibly small. Stripped of her arrogance, her entitlement, and her stolen wealth, she was nothing more than a pathetic, trembling shell of a human being. Valerie reached the bottom step and threw her arms around my calves, gripping my legs with a desperate bruising strength. She buried her face against my knees, her body racked with violent, ugly sobs. "I beg you," Valerie wailed, her voice a raw, agonizing screech that echoed down the street. "Nia, please, I beg you. He is your flesh and blood. You cannot let them take him away." I did not move. I looked down at her weeping form, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no remorse, no lingering sense of familial duty. The well of my empathy had dried up a long time ago. "I was wrong," Valerie sobbed, looking up at me with mascara streaming down her cheeks, her face twisted in pure agony. "I was so wrong about everything. I will make it up to you, I swear to God. I will do whatever you want. Just tell them to stop. Withdraw the charges." I stared into her pleading, desperate eyes. For decades she had held all the power. For decades she had used that power to crush my spirit, to elevate Trayvon at my expense, to ensure I knew my place as the worthless, invisible daughter. Now the roles were permanently reversed. I gently but firmly stepped backward, physically breaking her grip on my legs. My movement was decisive, a physical manifestation of severing the final tie between us. Valerie slumped forward onto the pavement, her hands grasping at the empty air where I had just stood. "You are not crying because you feel guilty towards me," I said, my voice ringing with an absolute terrifying clarity. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you suddenly care about our relationship. You are crying because the only ATM you used to show off to your country club friends has just collapsed. You are crying because your golden child is going to prison and the $15 million you thought you stole has vanished." Valerie shook her head weakly, opening her mouth to protest, but I did not let her speak. "You want to talk about flesh and blood," I continued, the memories of my past fueling the cold, calculated anger in my words. "Where was that loyalty when I was 19 years old? I waited for your protection the day my college tuition was drained from my bank account. I waited for you to be a mother to me when Trayvon stole my future to pay off his sports car. You knew exactly what he did, and you looked me right in the eye and told me to get over it." I looked at the federal vehicles, watching the heavy armored doors slam shut, locking my brother and my sister-in-law inside. The red and blue strobe lights painted the neighborhood in harsh, unforgiving flashes. I turned my gaze back down to Valerie, who was weeping uncontrollably on the concrete. "You told me that family sacrifices for each other," I said, delivering the final fatal blow to her reality. "You told me to be the bigger person. Well, I learned my lesson. My leniency died on that exact day. You made your choices, and now you are going to live with the consequences. Enjoy the quiet house, Mother. It is going to be very lonely from now on." I turned away from Valerie's crumpled form just as the federal agents forcefully guided Trayvon toward the gaping rear door of the central armored SUV. The reality of the dark, cramped transport space finally shattered his catatonic state. He planted his expensive Italian loafers against the asphalt, throwing his weight backward in a pathetic, clumsy attempt to resist federal authority. The agents did not even flinch. They simply adjusted their grips, their tactical gloves digging into the fabric of his tailored suit, and effortlessly overpowered his thrashing. He twisted his neck, the tendons straining against his collar, his bloodshot eyes locking onto me as I stood perfectly composed at the top of the stone steps. "You are a monster," Trevon roared, his voice tearing through the humid morning air, raw and hideously ugly. "You are cold-blooded. Naya, I am your brother. We share the same blood, and you are throwing me in a cage like an animal." He kicked out wildly, his panic stripping away every ounce of his manufactured corporate swagger. The polished facade he had spent his entire adult life cultivating evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, petulant child. "You betrayed your own family!" Trevon screamed, spit flying from his lips as the agents forced him closer to the vehicle. "You set me up! You are a traitor! You are dead to me!" His hysterical screaming acted like an air raid siren for the entire block. This was a neighborhood where wealth whispered, where scandals were hushed up behind drawn velvet curtains and addressed in polite, muted tones over organic matcha lattes. But today, the undeniable truth of Valerie's spectacular failure was being broadcast at maximum volume. Doors creaked open, wrought iron gates swung ajar. I watched Mrs. Abernathy, the neighborhood association president, whom Valerie had spent a decade desperately trying to impress, step onto her pristine porch in her silk morning robe. Her eyes were wide with undisguised morbid fascination. Next door, the newly arrived investment banker couple stood openly on their balcony cell phones, subtly angled to capture the spectacle. Every single person Valerie had lied to, every neighbor she had boasted to about her brilliant, successful son, was currently watching that same son being manhandled into a federal transport vehicle for felony fraud. Valerie's precious social standing, the pristine reputation she valued above the emotional well-being of her own daughter, was currently bleeding out onto the Brooklyn pavement for everyone to see. I did not respond to Trayvon's frantic insults. I did not need to justify my survival to the parasite who had tried to consume me. Instead, I reached over to the wide stone balustrade where I had set down my porcelain coffee cup earlier that morning. The coffee was likely lukewarm by now, but that hardly mattered. I picked it up by the delicate handle, my posture immaculately straight, my midnight blue suit entirely unwrinkled. I looked directly into Trayvon's manic, terrified eyes as the agents finally shoved him into the back of the SUV. With slow, deliberate elegance, I raised the cup in his direction. It was a silent, mocking toast. A final, absolute goodbye to a man who had dug his own grave and gleefully jumped inside. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off his frantic screaming mid-sentence. The heavy metallic thud echoed like a gunshot down the historic block. Chloe had already been secured in the vehicle behind him, her tear-streaked face buried in her hands, completely ignored by the husband she had just loudly promised to divorce. Prosecutor Arthur Sterling gave me a brief, respectful nod from the sidewalk. It was a quiet acknowledgement between two professionals who had successfully executed a flawless tactical operation. He climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. The engines revved in unison. The heavy tires gripped the asphalt, and the convoy of black SUVs pulled away from the curb, their red and blue strobe lights flashing violently against the brownstone facades, until they turned the corner of the avenue and disappeared entirely from sight. The abrupt departure left a ringing, heavy silence in its wake. The four hired thugs were still sitting on the curb waiting to be processed by the local police who had just arrived to secure the scene. Valerie remained on the pavement at the bottom of my steps. She did not scream anymore. She did not hurl insults or beg for mercy. She simply sat in the dirt, her expensive dress ruined, her carefully constructed social empire reduced to absolute ash. The neighbors were still watching, whispering to one another, pointing at the woman who had always deemed herself superior to them all. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on her, the sharp click of my heels ringing out against the stone as I walked across the wide porch. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door. The metal was cool and grounding beneath my palm. I pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold and pulling it firmly shut behind me. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking into place severed the outside world completely. The chaotic, ugly reality of the street faded into a muffled, distant murmur. I was finally alone. The entryway of the brownstone welcomed me like an old, fiercely protective friend. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass transom window above the door, casting warm, vibrant patterns across the original herringbone hardwood floors. The air inside smelled of beeswax polish, old paper, and the faint, comforting scent of lavender that my grandmother used to keep in the parlor. I walked slowly down the main hallway, letting the profound, anchoring silence of the house wash over my exhausted spirit. I reached out, trailing my fingertips along the ornate hand-carved mahogany wainscoting that lined the corridor. The wood was rich, dark, and perfectly preserved, polished by decades of meticulous care and fierce, uncompromising love. I closed my eyes, feeling the smooth grain beneath my skin. This house was not just an accumulation of brick and mortar. It was not a sterile portfolio asset meant to be violently liquidated to cover the gambling debts and vanity projects of a spoiled, mediocre man. This house was a living, breathing testament to survival. My grandparents had purchased this brownstone during an era when this neighborhood was entirely overlooked by the elite. They had bought it when redlining and systemic institutional barriers made it nearly impossible for Black families to secure a permanent foothold in the real estate market. They had scrubbed these floors on their hands and knees. They had worked triple shifts, sacrificing their own comfort, their own peace, and their own youth to build a fortress of generational wealth that would protect their descendants from a world designed to break them. They had poured their sweat, their dignity, and their unyielding pride into every single floorboard and plaster molding of this estate. Black heritage. True generational wealth is a rare and sacred thing. It is a beacon of resilience in an economy that constantly seeks to erase and consume it. It is absolutely not a commodity to be cheapened, divided, and sold off by greedy, empty people who possess no understanding of the blood it took to build it. Trevin and Valerie had looked at this architectural masterpiece and seen only a quick, dirty payout. They had been entirely willing to bulldoze history to shatter a century of careful preservation just to finance an illusion of success. But my grandparents had known better. They had possessed the sharp, unforgiving clarity to see the rot in Valerie's soul, and they had legally bound this property to the one person they knew possessed the strength, the intellect, and the ruthless devotion required to protect it. I walked into the grand parlor, looking up at the vintage crystal chandelier sparkling in the morning light. I placed my coffee cup on a coaster atop the antique credenza, feeling a deep, anchoring peace settle into my bones. The adrenaline and tension of the past 48 hours slowly evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of profound triumph. I had not just defended a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar transit hub buyout. I had defended my bloodline. I had protected the sanctuary that my ancestors had fought, bled, and died to secure. The predators had been excised, the rot had been surgically cut away, and the foundation remained absolutely unshakable. I stood in the center of the quiet, beautiful room, surrounded by the untouchable legacy of those who had loved me best. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of polished oak and sweet lavender. For the first time in my entire life, standing amidst the triumph of my own meticulous design, I was truly completely home. 3 days passed with the gentle, rhythmic predictability of a pendulum finally finding its absolute center. The oppressive, chaotic energy that had infected my existence for over 30 years had been surgically excised, leaving behind a profound and beautiful emptiness. I spent the weekend overseeing the minor repairs to the wrought iron front gate and finalizing the massive stack of municipal paperwork for the transit hub buyout. The $15 million had officially cleared the escrow account, transferring smoothly into the secure holding trust I had established. It was a digital confirmation of my ultimate victory, a staggering sum of money that represented far more than just financial security. It represented undeniable proof that I had outplayed, outlasted, and outsmarted the very people who had tried to bury me. I sat at the heavy oak dining table in the sunlit breakfast nook, the morning light catching the steam rising from my freshly brewed espresso. The house felt entirely different now. It was breathing again, free from the toxic, suffocating grip of my blood relatives. The heavy mahogany walls seemed to radiate a quiet, protective warmth. I was reviewing the final architectural mock-ups for a new commercial development project, feeling a sense of deep, unbroken focus that I had not experienced in years. The sudden sharp vibration of my cell phone against the polished wood broke the absolute tranquility of the morning. I did not immediately reach for it. I slowly leaned back in my chair, my eyes dropping to the glowing screen. The camera of my mind seemed to push in tight, focusing entirely on the caller ID flashing in harsh, bright letters. Valerie. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I picked up my porcelain cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, savoring the rich, dark flavor as it coated my tongue. I knew exactly why she was calling. The financial fallout from Trevin's federal arrest had been swift and mathematically ruthless. The government does not move slowly when they uncover interstate wire fraud. By the fourth ring, the phone inched across the table, vibrating with a desperate, frantic energy. I set my cup down perfectly in the center of its saucer, reached out and swiped the green icon, bringing the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. There was no arrogant demand on the other end of the line. There was no shrill entitlement, no sharp condescension, no toxic commands disguised as maternal advice. The imperious matriarch who had stood on my front porch, screaming about her superiority, was completely dead. In her place, there was only the wet, pathetic sound of ragged hyperventilation. Nia, the voice whimpered. It was a hollow, trembling rasp of a woman who had watched her entire manufactured reality evaporate into thin air. Nia, please, please do not hang up on me. The desperation in her voice was thick and suffocating. She wept, detailing the catastrophic total collapse of her financial house of cards. Trayvon's federal indictment had triggered an immediate massive freeze on all their connected accounts. The investigation had ripped the lid off their luxurious facade, exposing decades of severe debt shell games and leveraged assets. The massive credit lines she had maxed out to maintain her country club lifestyle, to buy the designer clothes and the leased luxury vehicles, had all instantly matured. The creditors had swarmed like bloodhounds smelling an open wound. The bank took it, she sobbed, her voice cracking into a hideous wail. The bank took the house, Nia. They served the foreclosure papers this morning. They are taking the cars. They are taking everything. The accounts are completely frozen and all my credit cards are declining. I have absolutely nothing left. My friends will not even answer my calls. Everyone has blocked me. She paused, gasping for air, her sobs echoing through the phone speaker and filling the quiet, sunlit kitchen. I have nowhere to go! Valerie begged, the sheer terror of her new reality bleeding through every single syllable. You have that massive brownstone. You have all those empty rooms. I am your mother, Nia. Please, you have to let me come stay with you. Just until I can figure this out. Just until I can get back on my feet. Please give me a place to sleep. I listened to her beg. The woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a worthless disappointment. The woman who had happily plotted to steal my inheritance to fund my brother's delusions. The woman who had laughed at my pain was now weeping into the receiver, begging me for a spare room in the very house she had actively tried to bulldoze just 72 hours ago. I looked around the beautiful, quiet kitchen. I looked at the restored antique cabinets, the pristine marble countertops, and the sunlight reflecting off the original hardwood floors. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant gaslighting, and the absolute lack of protection she had offered me when I was a vulnerable child. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. My voice when I finally spoke was calm, clear, and completely devoid of human warmth. I donated a portion of the $15 million fund to build a new charity shelter for homeless women in Brooklyn. I stated the words, slicing through her hysterical crying with absolute lethal precision. You can go there and register. I will tell the facility manager to prioritize a bed for you. Valerie stopped crying. A stunned, suffocating silence stretched across the line as her brain desperately tried to process the absolute finality of my refusal. She opened her mouth, trying to form a response, trying to find one last manipulative thread to pull. But I did not give her the chance. I lowered the phone from my ear, tapped the red button to end the call, and calmly navigated to her contact profile. With one final decisive tap, I blocked the number permanently. I set the phone face down on the table. The screen went dark. The silence in the brownstone rushed back in, wrapping around me like a heavy, warm blanket. There would be no more calls. There would be no more ambushes on my front porch. There would be no more emotional blackmail. The debt had been paid in full, and the ledger was finally permanently closed. I left the cell phone resting face down on the kitchen table and walked slowly back toward the front of the house. My footsteps were completely silent against the antique Persian runner that stretched down the central corridor. I moved with the effortless, unburdened grace of a woman who had just dropped a 30-year weight off her shoulders. The oppressive, frantic energy that had contaminated this property since the moment Trevon and Valerie arrived was entirely gone. The house felt as though it had finally exhaled. The bright, brilliant morning sunlight pierced through the intricate stained glass transom window above the main parlor doors. The antique glass fractured the light, throwing vivid jewel-toned splashes of ruby, sapphire, and gold across the polished oak floors. The colors danced across the room, illuminating the dust motes, swirling peacefully in the quiet air. I stepped into the parlor, feeling the deep, resonant history of the space wrapping around me like a protective shield. I walked over to the corner of the room and took a seat in my grandmother's vintage emerald velvet armchair. It was a beautiful, commanding piece of furniture, positioned perfectly to oversee the entire parlor. I ran my hands slowly along the soft, worn fabric of the armrests, feeling a profound connection to the resilient, brilliant woman who had originally purchased it. She had possessed the foresight to see exactly who Valerie was, and she had trusted me to be the ultimate guardian of our bloodline. I leaned back into the plush velvet, crossing my legs and looking around the pristine, quiet room. Society pushes a very dangerous, highly romanticized narrative about blood relations. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to believe that family is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We are taught that an accident of biology automatically grants certain people unrestricted access to our lives, our resources, and our peace of mind. We are pressured to offer infinite forgiveness and perpetual sacrifice under the guise of maintaining family harmony. But experience is a brutal, unforgiving teacher. I learned the absolute hardest way that family is not simply those who share your DNA. Sharing a genetic code does not make someone loyal, and it certainly does not make them safe. True family is defined entirely by those who protect you when you are at your absolute weakest. It is defined by the people who respect your boundaries, who celebrate your independence, and who would never dream of using your love as a weapon to dismantle your life. Valerie and Trayvon had built their entire identities on a hollow foundation of unearned superiority and staggering entitlement. They looked at me and saw nothing but an easy target, a quiet stepping stone they could crush on their way to a fraudulent empire. They called me the failed daughter. They openly mocked my career, my choices, and my quiet, unassuming life. They branded me a disappointment because I refused to play the role of the subservient victim in their toxic family dynamic. But when the smoke cleared, when the federal indictments were unsealed and the bank accounts were frozen, the truth was utterly undeniable. It was precisely that so-called failure who had possessed the intellect, the patience, and the sheer unyielding willpower to protect our grandparents' blood and sweat legacy. The house was safe. The history was preserved. The predators had been entirely eradicated from the ecosystem, and they had done it to themselves. People waste so much of their precious energy on anger. They exhaust themselves engaging in screaming matches, writing long emotional letters, and desperately trying to extract apologies from toxic people who are fundamentally incapable of feeling remorse. That is a fool's errand. I had watched my mother and my brother lie, cheat, and steal without a single ounce of hesitation. If I had reacted emotionally, if I had confronted them with tears and outrage, I would have given them exactly what they wanted. I would have given them my power. Instead, I chose a different path. I stopped reacting emotionally and started operating strategically. There is a very specific, highly insidious tactic that toxic families employ when they want to consume your resources. They will attempt to weaponize your conscience. They will tell you that you are being selfish. They will demand that you keep the peace. They will try to make you feel guilty for simply protecting what is rightfully yours. So let me offer you a piece of hard-won absolute truth. If anyone in your family ever looks you in the eye and tells you to put your legal rights aside for the sake of family loyalty, or asks you to sacrifice your future for the greater good of the family, do not argue with them. Do not raise your voice. Do not waste a single breath trying to justify your boundaries to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. Just smile, walk into your kitchen, brew a sweet, warm cup of tea, and immediately call your lawyer. Because the absolute sweetest revenge is not screaming matches on a front porch. It is not bitterness, and it is certainly not stooping to their level of petty manipulation. The sweetest revenge is legally binding government-stamped paperwork. It is impenetrable trusts, ironclad property deeds, and federal indictments. It is removing their access to your life with such surgical, devastating legal precision that they can never even attempt to touch you again. I sat quietly in the emerald chair, basking in the warm, colorful light streaming through the historic windows. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. The nightmare was permanently over, and the rest of my life was just beginning. That is my story. How about you? Have you ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who tried to take advantage of your loyalty and ruin your life? Share your story in the comments below.